I will give you an introduction to the new legislation and particularly give you a whiz through the key measures and the prioritisation of those measures for 2012 at a European level. And then June will give a few words of putting the legislation into the context of public health protection. So please bear with me. Please hold on tight, and I will whiz you through the new legislation in a presentation lasting about 30 to 40 minutes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the objectives of the new legislation. I'm going to summarise the key measures. I'm going to talk about the impact of the legislation in very high-level terms, particularly on the regulatory system. And part of that is to stimulate you to think what the impact might be on you. I'm sure you have been thinking about that. And then go a little bit into implementation, particularly looking at the things that will definitely be happening this year. In other words, things that you should anticipate before drawing a few conclusions. Next slide, please, Rita. The key point about this new legislation, and I'm focusing on the motivation for change, is that the burden of adverse drug reactions is very high. We need to put this in context. Clearly, medicines save lives, relieve suffering, and do a huge amount of benefit in terms of health and society. This is just focusing on the fact that there is a flip side, and estimated 197,000 deaths per year in the EU are from adverse drug reactions, and the European Commission, in its impact assessment published in 2008, estimated a cost to society in Europe of adverse drug reactions of nearly 80 billion euros per year. Next slide, please. So if you see that, the point is we must always strive to do better in terms of pharmacovigilance and promoting and protecting public health. What are the high-level objectives of this new legislation? Well, at the highest level, it's about promoting and protecting public health by reducing the burden of adverse drug reactions and optimizing the use of medicines. And this is delivered through sub-objectives, which are given in the bullet points on this slide. So clear roles and responsibilities and robust and rapid EU decision-making. Engagement of patients and healthcare professionals in the process. Science-based medicines regulation with integration of benefit and risk where appropriate. Risk-based and proportionate regulation. Increased proactivity and planning. Reduced duplication and redundancy within the system, including redundancy in reporting, and increased transparency linked to providing better information on medicines to users of medicines. I think without dwelling too much on this, the flip side of each of these bullet points are weaknesses that have been identified in the current system. And I won't go bullet point by bullet point, but if you see that one of the objectives is clear roles and responsibilities, one of the weaknesses of the current system has been that sometimes there has been a lack of clarity, certainly in legislation, about the roles and responsibilities between different actors. June, welcome to our meeting. I explained to the colleagues so that we had flipped order and late-breaking information indeed. So welcome, nice to have you with us. Next slide, please, Rita. Now, this in one slide is your aid memoir of all of the changes in the legislation. Now, clearly, the legislation is 2 legal acts and runs to probably 60 pages or so. And one slide doesn't really do justice to that. But if you just wanted to remind yourself of the scope of this legislation, this one slide is a useful place to start. And in my subsequent slides, I'll go through each of these bullet points, giving a little bit of further detail. So I'll just list, for the sake of this slide, the scope. So there are new provisions relating to strengthened coordination of medicines, including the compilation of lists of medicines at a European level. There are authorization requirement changes. There are changes relating to risk management plans, changes relating to post-authorization studies, both safety and efficacy, changes on effectiveness of risk minimization, changes relating to adverse drug reaction reporting, signal detection, periodic safety update reports, the scientific committees at European level and the decision-making process within the European system, transparency and communication aspects, coordination of inspections, not just pharmacovigilance inspections, but strengthened coordination of all of the different types of inspection at European level, pharmacovigilance audits, and then fees charged for pharmacovigilance and payments made to rapporteurs for assessments and services. The point of this slide, therefore, is to remind you of the very broad scope. This is not just narrow focus pharmacovigilance, which some people associate just with ADR reporting, adverse drug reaction reporting. This really is almost all aspects of the regulation of medicines in the peri and post-authorization phase. Next slide, please. So let's just go through each of those bullet points with one slide per bullet point, just to give you an overview. And if this is not fully comprehensive, and speakers in the individual sessions will be going into more detail, but again, this is just your appetizer, really, for the day to give you an overview. So coordination and lists of medicines, and this is particularly Article 57, which I know is very close to many of your hearts and has caused quite a lot of concern to many people in the audience in terms of meeting the deadline of this July to submit medicinal product information to the European Medicines Agency. We have specific presentations later on, but I just wanted to outline what the point of this is. The point is to strengthen the ability to coordinate medicines regulation in general and pharmacovigilance within Europe. It's about creating controlled lists of all EU products and the substances they contain. And this will support European databases, including EUTCT, which is the Telematic Controlled Terms database here at the agency, Vigilance, the Adverse Drug Reaction database, SciMed, which is the tracking database for centrally authorized products, as well as clinical trials databases, and I could go on. So basically, controlled lists of products and substances to support all of the information systems and databases that run the European system. The next and really important purpose of this is to identify products that are in adverse drug reaction reports. At the moment, and it will continue, we are receiving adverse drug reaction reports or suspected adverse drug reaction reports from all around the world. It's not a legal obligation on the companies to report them on to us, but frequently the product names are names that are not familiar to us in Europe, so we don't know what those products are and what the substances that they contain are. And you can imagine for data analysis purposes, for detecting new or changing safety issues, that's a huge challenge. One of the purposes of compiling these lists of products and substances, and particularly linking that to international collaboration on substance identification and product identification, is to ensure that we can identify the products and the substances that are the subject of reports of suspected adverse drug reactions. And finally, particularly in the scope of pharmacovigilance, these lists of substances and products will support our regulatory work. Let me give you one example as written on this slide. If tomorrow one of the member states or the European Commission referred the drug substance paracetamol to the European Medicines Agency because of concerns, for example, of hepatotoxicity, today we don't know what products are on the European market containing the substance paracetamol. So what we would do, we would send a fax to all of the national competent authorities asking them to list their products containing paracetamol, and then we would compile a list. So in other words, we do it ad hoc. Now, ad hoc loses time. Ad hoc is not always complete because there's not always a totally robust business process for quality assurance of the information received. But I'm sure it's apparent that having a comprehensive list of those products containing paracetamol is critical to the referral process, because in terms of legal certainty, we need to know what products the output of the decision-making process applies to, so that the companies that have the marketing authorizations for those products can be informed of the outcome of the referral, which will be legally binding on them. So having upfront comprehensive lists of products and substances in Europe allows us not to have to do that ad hoc compilation of products and substances when we have, for example, a referral. Just another business case for this collection of information under Article 57. If we go to the next slide, please, Rita. There are changes in terms of the marketing authorization dossier, and so I think the thing to flag here is that this is not just about your pharmacovigilance departments or pharmacovigilance colleagues needing to know. This is also about your regulatory affairs and your colleagues that are responsible for research and putting the dossier together for a new marketing authorization application. There are changes. Particularly the pharmacovigilance system description, which has been, I think, useful from a public health point of view, but really very burdensome in the past in terms of keeping it up to date, will no longer be submitted with the dossier. And instead, there'll just be a summary of the pharmacovigilance system in the dossier, and that will be balanced by companies maintaining a so-called pharmacovigilance system master file, which is a dossier you will keep on site, which can be inspected, which can be requested for submission. But basically, it's to some extent self-regulation. You will maintain that dossier yourself on your pharmacovigilance system. The impact is that this should lead to a reduction in variations to the marketing authorization, which is a burden on you, and also requires a lot of regulatory input from EMA and from the national competent authorities. Next slide, please. Risk management plans and post-authorization studies. This is really very, very high level, and there's quite a lot of detail here which may come out in presentations during the course of the day. But all new products will have a risk management plan. So this is all new marketing authorization applications will have to submit a risk management plan, and those will need to be proportionate in terms of detail to the risk posed by the product. Now, there's been quite a lot of comment about whether that's really justified for generic products for relatively well-established substances, but the law does very clearly state that all products applications will submit a risk management plan. The key point is to consider the known risks, the potential risks, and the missing information about the product, and to submit a risk management plan that is proportionate to that estimation of risk. There will be studies in the post-authorization phase for products posing risks or for products where there are important information missing. And these, so in other words, these could be safety studies or these could be efficacy studies. And there will be, I think it's fair to say, overall, more studies, particularly for new innovative products. And those studies that are done will be legally binding in terms of the milestones for conduct of the study, submission of interim and final study reports, etc. And there are new processes in place for the oversight of both protocols and oversight of results of studies, which I'm not going to go into now. Next slide, please. Now, quite an interesting feature of the new legislation, which hasn't received a huge amount of attention, is a new legal obligation to monitor the effectiveness of risk minimization. Now, this particular slide, I focus a little bit on the impact within the agency, but in the context of risk management planning, companies will need to ensure that they do measure whether a risk minimization measure you've put in place is having the desired effect in terms of doctors or pharmacists knowing about a particular risk and changing their behavior. And for the most important safety issues, the biggest threats to public health, that you're actually having the desired impact on medical events, if you like. So if we're talking about a drug that causes severe hepatotoxicity, actually this might lead to the requirement for a study looking at levels of hepatotoxicity when the drug is prescribed. But also linked to that are obligations on the regulators to also monitor the effectiveness of risk minimization. And the slide gives a few ideas about how not just industry, but also regulators and academia will have to share and pull together to do what is quite a challenging task to do well. Next slide, please. In terms of ADR reporting, I think this is very, very relevant to many to your work and to many of your daily activities. The legislation will, in time, lead to a centralization of company reporting to the Vigilance database only. Currently, you're reporting to individual national competent authorities all over Europe, and you're often reporting the same suspected adverse drug reaction report to the different authorities. And then the authorities are subsequently reporting those in to the Vigilance database. After a period of time, an interim period, that will all be centralized to the Eurovigilance database, which should therefore simplify your processes and also, I would hope, simplify the processes for the regulators also in time. However, and it's an important however, this does require information technology investment in the Eurovigilance system, and it is likely that it will be 2015 at the earliest before that centralisation takes place. A couple of other points about adverse drug reaction reporting. The legislation places an obligation on all national competent authorities, as well as all marketing authorisation holders, to accept patient reports as valid suspected adverse drug reaction reports. So the debate that's been raging for many years about the value of patient reports and how they would fit into the system really is over now. The point now is making sure that we introduce patient reporting in all member states, and we do it well to facilitate the role of patient reporting in safety monitoring. Final point on this slide is the legislation foresees that the EMA will take over certain responsibilities for literature monitoring, responsibilities that are currently undertaken by companies. The original business case for this was that we were receiving a lot of duplicate reports in the Eurovigilance system, particularly for literature cases for well-established substances, so from many of the generic companies. But this actually has a dual benefit, because both by EMA conducting these reviews, we reduce duplicates, but in addition, it means that the cost of that duplicate activity to the industry is reduced, and you can then reinvest those savings in other more public health focused activities. Again, for the sake of predictability for you, you should know that this is not going to happen in 2012. It's unlikely to actually start in 2013 because of budget constraints, but it is a legal obligation and will start in the coming years as soon as an income stream is found to support this. So in time, an important simplification for the industry, an important new responsibility for the European Medicines Agency, but it's not going to happen this year and probably not next year. Next slide, please, Rita. Detecting new or changing safety issues, so-called signal detection. There's a new legal obligation on the European Medicines Agency and the national competent authorities. So this is about clear roles and responsibilities that I was talking about earlier. Clearly, there's also a responsibility on the company for its own products, you as the stewards of your products. There will be more formal procedures and greater data extraction and clinical and pharmacy analysis that are required within the European regulatory system. And I think it's fair to say that the clarity builds on the success of signal detection within the regulatory authorities over recent years. So basically, this is putting the spotlight on the regulatory authorities in support of the work that the industry is already doing in signal detection for its own products. Next slide, please. Periodic safety update reports. Again, many of you will be familiar with the current system. We have really very major changes, and we have a dedicated presentation on this later. But just to give you some of the headlines. First, I'm going to speak to a bullet point that's not on this slide, which I spotted that I'd left off. The when to submit will change, and the which products will routinely submit changes. And it's actually a very important change. It's an important omission from this slide. So one of the key points, there will be no routine, the key word there is routine, periodic safety update reports for generic products and for certain other products that have been authorized through specific legal routes. And I suspect the more detailed presentation later will go into that. And in addition, the routine frequency for submitting PSURs will change. So whereas most products submit PSURs 6 monthly, yearly, 3 yearly at the moment, in the future there will be a risk-based approach where an individual decision will be made for an individual product as to when and the frequency to submit PSURs. And that will all be included in a public list so that companies have visibility about what to submit when. And just for your orientation, for those of you who didn't spot it, we launched a public consultation on a draft list a couple of weeks ago, and that public consultation remains open. So have a look at that, because if your products are on it, you may wish to respond to the public consultation. So that was the bullet point that's not on the slide. Now let's move to the bullet points that are on the slide. The purpose of a PSUR changes. Currently, a PSUR is an interval safety report, and in the future, it'll be a cumulative benefit risk assessment. So we move towards the integration of benefit risk, and we move towards the re-evaluation of benefit risk for products periodically in the post-authorization phase, which has not systematically been done, particularly since the changes to the renewal rules that were introduced about a decade ago. In time, and again, this is not something that's going to happen in 2012, but in time, EMA will process all the reports for the EU, so both for centrally authorised products and nationally authorised products. They will all be sent in electronically to the European Medicines Agency, and we will have to run a so-called repository, I think basically a database and tracking system, which makes the reports available to the member states, to the committees, to the assessors, to the rapporteurs, as well as the assessment reports for the business process of assessment. That will not happen this year, and I again do not think it will happen in 2013. There are transitional provisions in the legislation for that. Perhaps an important point is the third bullet point here. In terms of the process for PSURs, assessments will directly lead to legally binding outcomes. At the moment, PSURs are assessed, and frequently the national regulators or the Committee on Human Medicinal Products here at the EMA will then request a variation from a company. The new process, a variation request is not required because there's a legally binding outcome from the PSUR assessment, so a big change. So clearly this is changing workload, changing business processes, and will be an important transition over the next couple of years. Rita, next slide, please. Now, scientific committees and decision-making, this slide really doesn't do justice to some quite complex changes, but the headlines are that a new committee is established within the European Medicines Agency called the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee, the so-called PRAC, which has got a legally defined mandate and will be looking at all important risk and benefit risk issues in the peri and post-authorization phase. The outputs from this PRAC will, through the Committee on Human Medicinal Products or through the Coordination Group for Mutual Recognition and Decentralized Products, the so-called CMDH, they will then be directly legally binding on companies. And that is the key added strength in public health terms, that we're increasing expertise to support decision-making on one side, and that the outputs are directly legally binding on the other, so that we miss out a further round of negotiation between companies and member states at a national level on what the precise wording in an SPC would be, for example. And what that means is you deliver warnings, better prescribing information, changes to leaflets quicker for patients. Next slide, please. Okay, transparency and communication, really very important changes, again, summarized in a very high-level way in one slide. A major increase in documents that will be publicly available. So all recommendations, decisions, opinions coming out of the various committees about linked to risk and benefit risk will be made public. The only information that will be removed will be personal data protection, so to protect personal data protection, commercially confidential information will also be protected, but in the post-authorization phase, we have published guidelines on what is commercially confidential, and it really is only manufacturing-type trade secrets that are considered commercially confidential in the post-authorization phase. So basically, this means the information will be made public. There will be public hearings for certain referrals, and there's a lot of debate about the best way to deliver those public hearings. Are we going to follow the US model that many of you will be familiar with, or will we do it in a rather different and perhaps more European way? There will be coordination by the European Medicines Agency of national announcements on important drug safety issues. And finally, there will be new web portals, a European level and a national, and then in each member state, national web portals, where information about the benefits and risks of medicines will be accessible. So really big changes, dramatic increase in transparency, and a strengthening of the coordination of safety announcements to support safe and effective use of medicines in Europe. Next slide, please. Inspections and audit, strengthened coordination role of EMA inspections and European level inspections coordination, and lots of new audits. Audits for the EMA, audits for the national authorities, and audits for industry. So this is about ensuring that we really do have quality systems in place, not just in the industry, but also in regulatory authorities. Next slide, please. Final slide on the measures in this legislation. We will have fees charged for pharmacovigilance. And this is really important because it's a critical component of excellent public health protection to ensure we have adequate resources to conduct pharmacovigilance, and that means we need to have fee income for pharmacovigilance. This requires a change to the EMA fee regulation, and therefore it will not come in until 2014 at the earliest. Again, I stress that point for predictability in terms of your companies, the fees charged to your companies. It's possible that we might foresee a web-based fee charging system where small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as companies just working at a national level with only nationally authorised products, can pay a small fee so that you can spread the burden with a low fee across all of the marketing authorisation holders in Europe. But this is under discussion and will be for the Commission to make proposals on. The fee types and rapporteur payments will need to change compared to what we have at the moment. Next slide, please. Just one slide talking about impact. This is the biggest change to the legal framework for human medicine since 1995 and possibly longer. And therefore, what we're talking about is a huge change project. And I'm sure it is putting a significant burden of change on you. It's also putting a significant burden of change on us. We're committed to doing our best to manage that change process well, and communicating with you and trying to keep you well informed about what's going on is an important part of that, hence meetings like today. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the implementation within the European regulatory network has been going on now for well over a year, nearer 2 years, in fact. And I'm just going to give you a couple of highlights and then talk about what you can expect to see for certain being implemented this year. So we have set up a dedicated governance structure with 6 member state EMA project teams, supported by 12 EMA sub-project teams. And then we've been holding various stakeholder meetings to make sure that we hear what the different stakeholders are saying about implementation, listening to their concerns, etc. Next slide, please. This graphic just gives you an idea of the governance structure within the European regulatory system, and you'll see the 6 different project teams organised into audits and inspections, periodic safety update reports, ADR reporting and signals, risk management planning and studies, committees and referrals, and communication and transparency. Next slide, please. Now, what about implementation this year? What will you see this year? And I'll go very quickly, but just take note of some of the things that you will definitely see this year. So firstly, because in 2012 there is no new money at a European level for implementation of this legislation, and there are no new staff at European level for the implementation of this legislation, implementation has all been about process improvement, reprioritization, etc. And as a result, we've had to reprioritize and prioritize the implementation process. And we have focused our first priority on public health activities, or those activities will have the biggest impact on public health. The second priority has been given to transparency and communication activities, and the third priority to simplification activities. And simplification activities are particularly those that require IT changes, which would then lead to reporting changes like ADR reporting, PSUR, electronic reporting for you. And so that's come third in the ranking in terms of prioritization. Next slide, please. We've organised the implementation plan for this year into 4 areas: collection of key information, better analysis and understanding of data, regulatory action and communication. Go to the next slide, please. And if we just start with collection of key information, the risk management plans, the new procedure will start this year. So the new format and content, in fact, I'm sure there are questions coming later on the format and content, but the new procedure then for assessment of risk management plans will start this year. In terms of periodic safety update reports at a European level, we will implement the new procedure for centrally authorised products, and we will also publish as final the list of birth dates and submission dates, the one that's currently out in draft form for public consultation. Next slide, please. In terms of post-authorization safety study, we will implement the procedure for protocol approval and results management for centrally authorized products at a European level. Electronic submission of core medicines information by pharmaceutical industry, the Article 57 requirements. The deadline on you is July this year, and the validation of those data that you submit will start later in the year. Next slide, please. In terms of vigilance and signal detection, the revised processes for signal detection for centrally authorised products will start in the summer, as will, based on work sharing between the member states, signal detection for nationally authorised products. And we will continue to maintain the current vigilance system and to make more information from the system available, both to the national competent authorities, but also by starting to publish aggregated data for centrally authorised products, and that will happen later on this year. Next slide, please. In terms of regulatory action to safeguard public health, the PRAC will be established, and the revised mandate coordination group will also be established. And so this decision-making process that I emphasised earlier on will have such an important impact on getting new warnings, new recommendations on safe and effective use through to patients. That will be implemented as a priority this summer. The referral procedures, there's a new referral procedure which I haven't gone into in any detail in this presentation, but that will start also this summer and will lead to faster decision makings on the most important public health and benefit risk issues. And in terms of additional monitoring, I know there's quite a lot of interest, and maybe this will come up during the questions and answer sessions, but we will publish the first list of medicines with this additional monitoring status. And you may be aware that that's a public list of medicines subject to additional monitoring, and it has implications for what is written in the SPC and in the patient leaflet. Next slide, please. In terms of communication with stakeholders, we will start publishing PRAC and CHMP agendas, minutes, recommendations, and opinions. So the level of transparency will go up this year. This is not something that you need to wait for. The level of transparency, dramatic increase this year. Coordination of safety messages, we're going to go step by step, but we will start with coordination of member state important safety messages this year. And public hearings, at least in principle, if we have a relevant referral, a relevant safety issue in the autumn, we may hold our first public hearing if that kind of referral comes into the agency. Next slide, please. And then we go to the next slide. I just wanted to outline good pharmacovigilance practices. The public consultation, I think, closed today or yesterday. I'll check that and let you know later on in the meeting. I think it's now closed. But the point of good pharmacovigilance practices is to be a really helpful how-to-do user guide for particularly industry, but also regulators and other stakeholders working in pharmacovigilance. And the structure, so this will replace the old volume 9A, which many of you will be familiar with. And the structure of good pharmacovigilance practice is going to be is the same for each module, with an introduction that gives the legal basis, a section B which underlines structures and processes. And the idea of these are that these might be generalizable to global systems. And it may be, for some of these modules in the future, that we take the section Bs to ICH and try and get harmonized global guidance between US FDA, Health Canada, Japan, etc. Which, for those of you, I mean, you're an SME audience, but those of you who will or do operate beyond Europe, that will then hopefully make it simpler for you to operate in that global market. And finally, section C is the nitty-gritty of how the European system works and what you have to report where and all this kind of thing. So that's the structure of good pharmacovigilance practice. If we go to the next slide, it's to conclude. So I've given you a very rapid overview of the different measures in the legislation, and it is not fully comprehensive. You're going to get much more detail in subsequent presentations. I've also emphasized what will be done this year, so what you can have reasonable certainty you will see this year. And I have just outlined to you that good pharmacovigilance practices will be very important in terms of you knowing how to conduct your pharmacovigilance within the companies. And so to conclude, I strongly believe that excellent public health protection and excellent pharmacovigilance requires really robust law, it requires good science, and it requires adequate resources. We're focusing today on new law, but we're also working within the European regulatory network and with stakeholders to make sure that we improve the science and improve the resources available. And we're building a new EU pharmacovigilance system for better public health protection and promotion. So thanks very much indeed.